Not even necessarily in this class, but I'm starting to get emails, students needing right to isolate, quarantine, concerned about health. Some people have health, are not feeling well, of course, just not having anything to do with COVID. And some people are having roommates, right, that need to quarantine or whatever the case may be. So that, by the way, is not necessarily indicated with any of the seats that might be empty today, or the people might not be here. I don't even often know who I'm getting emails from, right? Just that they need to spend some time or be away from class. So that raises, this is kind of the conversation we were having last Thursday, except though it raises the question for all classes. And so how to manage that is the question. And so having some experience with this last year, my recommendation basically is that I have a Zoom link. I establish a Zoom class and it's there. I won't be able to probably, we can't replicate the full scale of in class online, but at least if somebody needs to be gone for whatever reason, and some people need to be gone just for travel or whatever, it at least gives them some basis. I can record that class. People can at least get a sense of what we talked about in class, right? Do the reading, and they don't feel like they're behind. So that's how we're going to manage. Cool. Unless anybody has any other options, thoughts, opinions. I think it's probably the best way to manage, to make sure the guidance for the university, right, is that we don't create any structures or processes for class attendance which disincentivize effectively people missing, right? Because the last thing we want is, if you're not feeling well, whether it's COVID or otherwise, the last thing anybody wants really is for you to be in class. Does that work? I think it's the most supportive we can be for all students, given a variety of circumstances. So that's what I'm going to do. So if you end up in that situation, I wasn't able to establish it before today. I have it just established today, so I wasn't able to talk about that today. So one of the things that will be posted each week, and it may be useful if we have a discussion or something, is that recording from that particular day will then be posted after the fact. I usually am able to get to them by the end of the day, but sometimes it takes me till the next day. There'll be a link in there. I upload things to YouTube. I think it's the most accessible place to go. Does that work for everybody? Right, rather than actually just uploading the MP4, I think it's easiest to just upload the thing to YouTube. I title it for that day, right? So it'll be something like 21FA_ sic301_ class_ 2021 month date. That way they're all in order. And then I also link them that way in the class. So you can just go to that day's class, click on it if you have to miss. Is that good for everybody? But what I'm also hearing in conversation is we want to the degree possible, again, right? We don't want to disincentivize people from missing, but we also want to maintain an element of on-ground class. Yes, that's what I heard from you last week. Is that fair? So that's how we'll proceed. Good to go? All right. So our plan for the day is to talk about what sport is. That chapter is not especially complex. I don't think it'll take that long. If we have time today, because I was able to secure a guest for Thursday, if we have time today and people are comfortable doing it, I had articulated for Thursday to an assignment where you're the expert. So starting to articulate the ways that you're interested in gaining expertise in sport, or the way that you interact with sport in a variety of ways. It's just 3 to 5 lines. If you're comfortable with starting that today, that'd be great. We could start that. If you're not comfortable, we could wait till Thursday, but that means it might push it back to next Tuesday, because I do have a speaker coming in, and it's Professor Marty Most. Has anybody ever taken class with Marty Most? No? That discussion will probably run a little long, is my guess. Marty's fantastic. He's very dynamic, and he can speak on a variety of topics. So do you have any sense of whether you're comfortable going around the room and doing an introduction about your sort of the role sports play in your life? It's not like a high stakes issue. I just want us to start thinking about that more systematically. Could we start that today, or do you really feel like you want to wait till Thursday? You're good? All right, so let's start off with this. It's not an especially great image. Play versus games versus sport. What is the distinction between these three? Go ahead.
Rules and regulations just kind of you go up. Obviously, play there's nothing, and then games you start getting some rules and expectations. And then sport is when you get like a league and actual structure to everything.
Okay.
And then careers when you start making money off of it.
Yep. So that's certainly one good way to look at it. I don't know if it's necessarily that there are no rules. If you've ever watched a bunch of third graders negotiate the rules of the play on the playground, right? It's that there's no institutionalized rules, right? And they're not codified. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. True. What else? Go ahead.
Well, they're all each important to build on. When you start play, you're teaching fundamentals, you're teaching bases, and you progress the past game like section of the different sports and stuff that you're going to proceed through life.
Yep. So play tends to be, can either be really sort of just a freewheeling sort of a thing, right? Or it could be a little bit more organized, and then the level of competition, right? So if you're in games, you have a level of competition, but not necessarily a physical attribute, right? Or a physically demanding aspect, right? And sport and then work. That makes sense. Are there other differences? Go.
Like kind of related to the competition thing, like it's harder to make it to the next level. Like I think the transition from like playing to like games is pretty easy, but then like to make it to like sport and like being like a league, like you do it, but it's still a little difficult. And then like to make it to like the highest level, so it gets harder and harder to make it to.
Yeah, there's another pyramid, right? Which is the likelihood of continuing on, right? I mean, has anybody ever looked up football as one that's commonly noted, right? The number of high school players versus the number of college players, right? Versus the number of, right? I mean, it goes from like millions to 385, right? Getting in just very, very, or a few thousand going to college. It's in baseball's not dissimilar. I don't watch it a lot. Basketball, I gather, to go professional in basketball because they tend to, right? The teams don't turn over nearly as much as, so I gather. Is that true? I don't follow the NBA or the WNBA that much. Go ahead. There are fewer players on each team, right? So your teams are smaller because you only have you generally have 1-2 lines, maybe 15. That's not a lot, and they tend to last for a while. I mean, some notable examples because that's all I know. I don't follow basketball that much. Kobe played for what, better part of 20 years, right? And that's not uncommon, I gather, right? The career is a little football is shorter, I gather. So yes, the pyramid in the ability to move to the next level, right? And so in some respects, it's like I remember when I went to fire academy, right? And there's a speech that a full-time firefighter, career firefighter gave to a recruit class, right? And they showed this video when we were finishing fire academy. Because you look at it, and statistically speaking, the number of career firefighters in the United States is synonymous basically with getting into something like the NFL. You don't think about it that way, right? But it's actually a very small group of people who actually make it that far. Right? I wasn't a career firefighter. I was a part-time firefighter. The idea still holds, right? It's actually a small group of folks. What else stuck out to you as far as game versus sport? Anything that was striking? You've talked about the physical component, competition, institutionalized. Go ahead. Did you have something?
Well, you basically said it after.
I apologize for getting there too quickly.
But I can say like the games and inactive games and there's active games, sport games, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Football.
Yes.
And then I thought what was kind of interesting after they mentioned like the X games, like kind of like stood out.
Yeah, some of the most interesting conversation in this area is actually in what you might consider sort of gray zone, right? Like it's interesting to me. Does anybody watch the Olympics? Right. I'm fascinated by the Olympics and the sports that, right, that sort of come up. Like not rafting, they don't call it rafting, right? But help me. Can you slalom, kayaking? Thank you. Like I actually have a friend who does that competitively, right? There's, it's like I hadn't thought about it. That seems odd to me, right? And maybe it's just because I'm old and I admit fully guilty. I'm old. That seems odd. And at the same time, when I think about it, it's like there's a tremendous amount of skill, tremendous amount of physicality, right? Like a huge amount of practice that goes in that. Like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But then you get to something like skateboarding. Does that seem odd to you? But when I think about it, it does to me simply because it wasn't there historically, right? And at the same time, when I think about it, it's like I can't even stand on one of those things. So it makes sense, right? And so it's very interesting. Then what do you do with something like esports or gaming?
I thought it was interesting how it used like ESPN as kind of like a judge of that. Since it was on ESPN, it's not a sport. And then when something gets on ESPN, you can more so consider it a sport. And so now esports are on ESPN too. So it's kind of even got more of a gray area there.
Yeah. And you can't say, well, they don't have much viewership. They have a huge viewership, right? Esports have a huge viewership. Now, it's not necessarily a cardiovascular activity, although I suppose, if you're really getting into the game, maybe it is, right? But there's certainly an element of talent involved, right? Are there many people gamers in here? Some, right?
Kind of how it used darts as an example of hand-eye coordination as being a sport. Like I feel like most video games is also, you could argue hand-eye, that only the top level people can go as fast as they go would be as good as some of the people are hand-eye and moving.
So I'm about to reveal something, right? Just a little bit. So through the pandemic, right? You had people, they ended up picking up weird stuff, right? Like, so I started playing Fortnite with my son. Every class that I revealed that to giggles, don't worry about it. It's okay, right? I'm comfortable with it. Because I had never really gamed before, right? But he was kind of isolated. And so he played Fortnite. So I'm like, well, we'll play Fortnite. And if you don't, if you're thinking there's not a physical or sort of a talent aspect of that game, like go on YouTube and watch somebody who's really good at building in Fortnite. Like they're just wicked crazy, right? I mean, how fast they can build and what in that game is just, it's crazy, right? And so esports is an interesting, and we have a really successful esports team here, right? Is anybody associated or know about it? So we do have an esports team here, and they've gone into some competitions and they've done quite well, as I understand anyway. Again, that's not particularly my thing, but yes. So what other examples of sort of gray space, right? Or gray, is that an activity, sport, recreational activity? What about golf? Sport? Based on the chapter, I would say, yes, it is. Is it the same as others? No, right? I've heard some people argue that it's a recreational activity as opposed to a sport. Fair enough. Another sort of example that seems sort of at the boundaries is speed walking in the Olympics. My kids could not understand speed walking. They're like, it's running. It's like, no, it's not running. You can't run, right? And they're like, well, it looks like running. I'm like, it's not running, right? And it's that sort of space. Give me other examples, because they're interesting. Examples that are sort of at the boundaries of what we might think of. Go ahead. Horse, like equestrian?
Yeah.
So are you talking about like the
Like jockeys kind of
where they're jumping over stuff and all that?
Yeah, like whether
Or are you talking about horse racing like track?
all of it. It's like whether we consider the jockeys or the trainers to be like.
Oh, I see. So you're talking mostly about a track, although others is the same. Yeah.
It's really the horse being important. You have the fastest horse, and you have someone sitting on the horse. So
Yeah.
Kind of, I think what he's saying.
Yes. Yeah, and my understanding is there is certainly sort of an activity or connection or interactivity between the jockey and the horse, right? It's not, I couldn't jump on and do that. Well, first of all, I'm 4 times too big, right? Good example. Others? Yeah.
Ping pong.
Ping pong. Sport, activity?
Sport.
I think so. Seems to be a lot of talent involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way they move. man.
Oh, it's crazy.
I'm sorry. Certainly a normal person that can do that.
I can't do that. Pickleball seems to, as I'm told, is becoming much more popular lately, right? Which is sort of I gather, a cross between ping pong and tennis.
Yeah, a shorter court, bigger, weirder paddle.
Yeah. The sort of paddles are bigger. The ball's a little different. Is the ball different?
Almost like a racquetball, right?
Yeah.
Almost like a racquetball ball.
Yeah. And then the courts are also differently structured, right? Yeah, tennis is crazy. I mean, speaking of, I'd never really watched tennis. My kids really got into tennis this year, right? So they took tennis lessons and they've been taking tennis lessons for a while. And I never understood the scoring. That's crazy. That's a crazy game. It's wickedly awesome. It just took me a while to understand it. Other examples that are at the boundaries. Go. Surfing. Yes. It's clearly competitive. It's clearly right. There's a physical aspect. That's right. There's clearly strategy. And at the same time, it's like that feels different than other sorts of things. But at the same time, it's like it fits the categories. What about curling? Does anyone watch curling or bean toss? Similar sort of thing, right? It's like it's not an especially physical activity. At the same time, there's a lot of talent that goes into. Does everybody know what I mean by curling? You have to watch the Winter Olympics, I guess, right? Or come from a cold climate, right? It's where they throw those big sort of, what do they call those? The big steel stones or whatever. They're called stones. And they're crazy how, right? I mean, their delivery is fantastic. Bean toss is similar. It's like, what about bean toss? Otherwise, right? I think it's sometimes called cornhole. I don't know. Yeah.
Kind of iffy on that one being
Well,
but I mean, it's there. So.
there is a talent aspect. There is a competitive aspect. That's where it becomes, it's like, so where's that boundary, right? Go ahead. Bowling. Yes. Yeah, bowling's in that same sort of space, right? Like clearly there's a talent aspect, right? If anybody has gone bowling and throwing gutter balls for an hour, right? It's clearly there. There's a physical aspect to it, right? Not that it's necessarily highly cardiovascular, but there is a physical performance aspect for sure. Others, go ahead.
The big one is cheerleading.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a sport when it's like in a competition. I don't think it's a sport when it's like outside of another sport. So, like,
Okay.
High school cheerleaders cheering on.
But what if that's a practice for the competition?
Just
Just throwing it out there.
yeah. Sure. I mean, if they're practicing competitively, then to be competitive
Yeah.
with other cheer squads, then yeah, it's a sport.
Yeah. At that competitive level, there's certainly, I mean, there's a highly competitive and highly, I mean, some of the things that, cheer squads do is crazy, right? I mean, physically speaking. Back here,
I was gonna say fishing.
fishing. Uh-huh. Sport, recreational activity. It's hard to,
I don't know. I was gonna say sport.
it feels like that same sort of space, right? Where it's like, that's not exactly what I thought of as a sport. At the same time, right? There certainly are competitions for it. In fact, I mean, if at that level, people spend tremendous amount of money on for recreational equipment. And at the same time, I have a difficult time looking at that as being somehow synonymous to, a highly competitive level of, I don't know, volleyball or something like that. Yeah, it's interesting. Good. I think you just need a working sensibility of this, right? And I think it's just a good place to start off thinking about it in a sense, simply because we tend to talk more about sport, right? Sort of whatever might be sort of more purely in that bucket of things than activities or game, right? Whereas this class is not game and society. That would be an interesting class for sure. Right, but it's useful place to start simply because we're really talking more about more about sport than we are about game. And so here's basically the same thing that we just went over. in the class discussion. There are ways to study sport. I think it's useful. So first of all, I'm going to actually stop on the top of page, what is it, 12 here? It's paginated page 11 or 10 on the PDF. Right, so this is, I told you this book was dated. Can anybody look at this section and tell me why this is dated? Is it just football players or is it all college sports? So name, image, likeness is a huge issue right now, right? And NCAA changed regulations, what, as of July 1st, I think? So I promised you that this book was dated. This is an example of how it's dated. So, and I think there's actually been a couple of court cases over some issues associated with this, but let's set that aside. So I just want to talk about these really quickly, right? So there's sort of different domains. Biophysical domain, right, where you're looking at the actual function, exercise physiology, nutrition, biomechanics. Psychosocial, sport psychology, motor learning and such, pedagogy, sociocultural, right? So you're thinking about sport history, philosophy and sport sociology. This class, in a sense, fits not in any of those other categories, in part because we're studying sport and society within a broader context of communication and media, right? And so this class, could take this class in a number of different directions. The direction I've taken it is exploring, obviously, the relevance and the importance of sport in our lives from a variety of perspectives, but then also I've really taken a pre-professional sort of approach, and that is, in what ways do you want to consider, maybe that you're not going to end up doing so, what way is sport and those intersections a potential career opportunity for you? Right. So it is absolutely about development. It is absolutely about the person. It's also, you know, I mean, it's about the concepts, and it's all those things are really important. But we've also built in pretty kind of an obvious pre-professional focus, that is thinking about all those different intersections and all those different places that sport is important in our lives, partly through the lens of what sort of career opportunities, right, are emerging or that might come up from that, right? And so we're going to talk about coaching next week as an example, and we'll talk about coaching both in its importance just as a community endeavor, but there's also, you know, potential long-term, whether it's career or just an advocation, there are also long-term opportunities and ways to think about that in your, you know, just the role it has in your life in general. Good? How's that for chapter 1? You good with that? So are you ready to go around the room and just do a quick intro? So what I'm looking for, and the way I wrote up the assignment, I can bring it up if you want, is just 3 to 5 sort of substantial sentences on what role does sport play in your life, right? And maybe what roles do you want it to play in life? And I think it's a useful thing to think about on the front end, in part because I'm asking you on the back end to start articulating the ways in which you're going to be an expert in a particular area, and the ways, the sort of development or ways that the skills that you're developing that you might bring to bear if you decide to, you know, go into sport as an area of expertise. Right. And so I am a firm believer, let me sort of back up and just talk just about that briefly. I'm a really firm believer in what I would describe as sort of the matrix approach to higher ed. And that is thinking about the sort of skills that you have, right? The baseline skills that you're developing, and the industry that you're practicing those in, right? And so it looks very different to be a journalist, say, in a sport context than in a health context than it does in a tech context. Do you see my point? Right? So sport becomes a domain where you're practicing your craft, right? So thinking about what is my craft, what do I do really well, and what do I want to develop as an individual, both for my own personal sensibility and my own personal satisfaction and just sort of who I am in life, but then also because I can bring that to bear on a potential career. Does that make sense? Sport is one of those interesting contexts because you have a really wide range of skills that you might develop and how those come to bear. Now, maybe again, that's for as a profession or a career, but it also may be as a volunteer opportunity long-term. I think I mentioned in the past, if I haven't mentioned, or if I have mentioned, I apologize for the repeat. If I haven't, then I'll let you know. So I umpire. Umpiring is not the sort of thing I anticipated doing. I didn't plan on umpiring. I umpired the same reason that most people who umpire, because we all showed up to my kids' baseball team one year, and there are two people who had been umpires for the last 2 years. And Jerry said, I'm ready to be done. Somebody needs to be the team umpire. And so we looked around, and there was all of 3 other people there. 2 of them turned around and walked away. And so I was left. And so I guess, all right, so I guess I'm going to do this. But like anything, I took it seriously because that's just who I am. And and it's a fascinating thing for me because, we were talking about institutionalized rules. You mentioned institutionalized rules, and some other people did. Baseball seems like one of those games. It's like when I started, I was like, oh, this is fairly straightforward. Baseball's fairly easy. No, baseball is crazy complex, right? Sort of whether something's obstruction or interference, and the runners. I mean, there's a tremendous amount. The book is that thick for a reason, right? I mean, it's actually pretty complex. And in part, so I got involved in that, and then I ended up, I just umped a lot because I was comfortable doing it. A lot of people in youth sports, right? Umpires don't want to take the plate, if you know what I mean, right? Sort of be behind the plate. They don't mind being in the field, but they don't want to be the one sort of ultimately responsible. And I was comfortable with that. So I ended up doing that more and more. I ended up becoming the umpire in chief for the league, right? Not because I campaigned to do it, just because literally nobody else showed up in part. And then I started umpiring for the district. And this last year I umpired for both district games and then for the state games for the Little League tournament. And that was awesome, right? I mean, it was fantastic. And to me, it's a really nice way to give back to a community, right? Because youth sport is, sort of dying from lack of volunteers. And so that's an important thing. I don't make money at it, and I don't plan on making money at it, but it's an important activity for me. And so that is my primary connection of sport. Of course, I also connect with sport in other ways. We play fantasy football, although I'm terrible at it and I don't keep up with stats that well. And so I am almost always losing in fantasy football, but that's okay. Somebody needs to, and I'm okay with that. So anyway, you just have a couple of sentences sort of articulate some of the key ways that sport intersects in your life or is important in your life. That'd be great. Well, we just go around the room. You ready to go? Oh, and introduce your name too, if you would.
Yeah, and the question is how sport is.
How does sport intersect with your life?
Would you like me to stand up?
No.
Okay.
You may.
Sure, I'll stand up.
It's up to you.
I'm Brandon Duplaney. I'm from SoCal. I grew up playing baseball my whole life. That's my #1 diehard sport.
What position?
I was catcher.
Okay.
I was taught by an ex-professional baseball player who happened to be my neighbor. So baseball is just my go-to for sure. I love football, I play fantasy football, and Dallas Cowboys fans the day I died. So fight me on it.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
My name is Michael, and sport to me has been a big part of my life. I played soccer my entire life. I still play to today, except this past year I tore my ACL, so I've been recovering from that. It's influenced a lot of my life. Got to meet a lot of amazing people. My dad was in the military, so I got to travel around the world.